आम्ही टॉवर ऑफ लंडन पाहायला आलोय. त्याची तिकीट आता आम्ही इथं आत जाणार आहोत. टॉवर ऑफ लंडन म्हणजे एक प्रकारचा किल्लाच हा जमिनीवरचा आणि विमान जात आहे म्हणून मी बोलणं थांबवते. हा तर टॉवर ऑफ लंडन हा खरं म्हणजे किल्लाच आहे, पण आपल्याला किल्ला म्हणजे डोंगरातल्या किल्ल्याची सवय असते, त्याच्यामुळे मला खूप वेळ लक्षात नाही आलं की हा किल्ला आहे. हा जमिनीवरचा किल्ला आहे आणि पहिली 500 वर्ष वगैरे इथे राजा स्वतः राहत होता त्या काळचा. त्याच्यानंतर त्यांनी ह्याला तुरुंग म्हणून वापरायला सुरुवात केली आणि हा खूप कॉन्ट्रोवर्शियल तुरुंग राहिलेला आहे, खूप इनफेमस तुरुंग. याचं कारण इथे खूप वेगवेगळ्या प्रकारच्या लोकांना वेगवेगळ्या प्रकारे मारून टाकण्यात आलेलं आहे. त्याची ती हिस्ट्री सांगतात पूर्ण, त्याचा एक गायडेड टूर देतात आणि अजून एक अट्रॅक्शन म्हणजे इथे राजघराण्याचे काय म्हणतात त्याला दागदागिने ठेवलेले आहेत, ते पण बघायचे आहेत. कोहिनूर बघायचा आहे म्हणून आज आम्ही टॉवर ऑफ लंडनला आलो आहे. तर आता टूर सुरू करूयात.
I can smell expensive perfume and pancakes. Are there any Americans here? Of course. Anyone here from Europe? Anyone from Great Britain? Anyone here from London? Yeah, whereabouts?
Bermondsey.
Where? Bermondsey? Lovely. Doesn't matter where you're from, you're most welcome to His Majesty's Royal Palace and Fortress, the Tower of London. My name is Mark. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
Now for the next 5 hours, I'm going to be your guide. I'm going to talk in a monotone voice about medieval architecture, banging on about flying buttresses. We're going to have a great time. I'm going to take you on a tour of the tower, point out some historic buildings and tell you stories relating to them, okay? Stories, not necessarily the truth. I don't want any of you coming up to me later on going, oh, I think you'll find that was the Duke of Norfolk. Because I think you'll find I don't care. Our story begins way back in 1066 when William, the Duke of Normandy, now known as William the
Conqueror.
defeated the Anglo-Saxon King Harold at the Battle of
Hastings.
Yeah, not quite so many of you joining on that one. Someone very proudly shouted Waterloo yesterday. Anyone here from France? Oui. Bonjour. Enchanté. That's all I got. William was crowned King William I on Christmas Day of that year, but he had to continue to fight his Saxon subjects who did not take kindly to Norman domination. William was looking for somewhere to build a citadel to impress and dominate the citizens of London, and he chose a site just inside the eastern city walls where once a Roman fort had stood. In 1078, he authorised the building of his first royal palace and fortress in this country. Today we refer to it as the White Tower, and it's over there behind those buildings. Don't bother looking, it's behind those buildings. Over the next 200 years, successive monarchs continued to add to the tower's defences. The inner bailey, or defensive wall, containing 13 smaller towers, was constructed in around 1220. In 1280, King Edward I held a meeting with all his knights and barons, and he said, we're going to build a wall.
2,000 years later.
It's going to be great.
It looks like it.
And the Scots are going to pay for it. And he did. He built another wall with 6 more towers, all of which face south, to defend against an attack should it come from France. Another part of the tower's defence was a moat, you can see over there. Again, this was dug during the reign of Edward I and was considerably deeper than it is now. It was designed to make use of the tidal flow of the River Thames. For twice a day at high tide, the river would flow in and around the moat and flush it clean. Does that sound like a good idea?
No.
It didn't work. Over time, all the rubbish, raw human sewage, dead animals, dead tourists, flowed downstream into our moat and sank to the bottom. Over time, we successfully created the largest cesspit in Europe. This situation continued for a period of 500 years. Imagine what it must have smelt like on a warm summer's day. Bermondsey. Eventually it got so bad we had to fill it up with sand and shingle to the level it is now. So, as I said earlier, this was the first royal palace and fortress of its kind to be built by the Normans in this country, but over the years it's been employed in many other ways. For example, this is still the place where we keep safe the crown jewels and royal regalia, and has been since 1303. This was the location of the Royal Mint, where all the coins of the British Empire were designed and produced until 1810. British Empire. Yeah. British Empire. Right. If you come from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada, Zimbabwe, quite a lot of Africa, Gibraltar, Malta, Cyprus, the Middle East, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, quite a lot of China, the Caribbean islands, the Falkland Islands, the Pitcairn Islands, the Cook Islands, the Solomon, quite a lot of islands, including the United Kingdom and Ireland, but at some point or other, you have been part of the British Empire. And therefore, I'd like you to join me in an enthusiastic and rousing huzzah!
Yeah.
Try that again. Huzzah! Huzzah! Ah, very good. I'm mildly impressed. Let's hear the Americans have a go. Huzzah! Rubbish. And by the way, you don't get to say huzzah. You made your choice. However, we have been getting on quite well recently, so I'm willing to give you guys a yeehaw, which is one down from a huzzah. So let's try that again. Everyone who's not from America, British Empire! Yeah! America! Yeah! That's why you'll never have an empire. We used to have a prison here, a state prison, one of the most notorious prisons in history, and there's the bars to prove it. Anyone here from Australia? Shame, it was a good joke. Doesn't matter. This was a place of murder, torture, and executions. Now, talking of executions, when you leave the tower later on, go across there, go up the hill, go across the road and into the garden. In the garden, there's a large plate on the floor, which will tell you that that was the old permanent execution site. Many people died up there between the 14th and 18th century. Some of them were burned to death, some were hanged, and 75 men of noble birth were to lose their heads up there by means of block and axe. Just for a moment, let's pause and imagine the scene up there on the day of an execution. Thousands of bloodthirsty, unwashed, stinking peasants from Bermondsey. Fortunate you came, didn't you? We're gathered up there for a day of fun and festivity. Yes, fun. They'd have brought the children, grandma and the picnic basket. They'd be watching the jugglers, the fire eaters, the dancing bears and the men on stilts. Everyone was having a super time. Except for one. The condemned man would be let out of one of our buildings. He'd be wearing his finest clothes. He'd be dragged along here and up the hill to booing and jeering crowds and people pelting with old fruit and vegetables. When he gets to the top, he's got to climb the big wooden steps. At the top of those wooden steps, he's met by a giant of a man dressed all in black leather. Calm down, madam. It's not what you think. He'd deliver a fine speech, say his prayers, and place himself down with his neck resting on a block of oak. He'd give a word or a signal. The executioner would bend down, pick up the heavy, clumsy axe, raise it aloft, and bring it crashing down through that poor, unfortunate soul's neck. There'd be an ooh from the crowd. Ooh. There'd be a gush of blood. The executioner would bend back down, pick up the severed and still bleeding head by the hair, hold it aloft for all to see and loudly proclaim, "Behold the head of a traitor, so die all traitors, God save the king!" And the crowd would go wild and cheer.
God save the Queen.
And the crowd would go wild and cheer! Buy a ticket! The head would be impaled on a pike and carried from the streets of London to London Bridge, which in those days was the only bridge across the River Thames. The head would then be left displayed upon the gateway entrance, a sign of the fate that would await all would-be traitors. Meanwhile, the headless corpse would be taken down, placed into a small hand cart, and brought back into the tower. It would trundle through the archways and up to the Chapel Royal, where it would be quickly buried inside the chapel in an unmarked grave. We're going to follow the route of that blood-soaked cart. We're going to walk in the footsteps of people who have changed the world. People like King Henry VIII, people like Queen Anne Boleyn, people like Sir Walter Raleigh. Are you ready to embark on a gruesome, gory journey of over 900 years?
Yeah!
Are you ready to follow me? Yeah! Will you follow me on Twitter? Fair enough. Come on. Here is 50 feet high. The outer one over there is 45 feet thick. And down there is Mint Street, so named as that was where all those coins of the British Empire were designed and produced until 1810. Now the buildings that house that factory are known as the casemates, and they serve as not only a museum, which you can visit just over there, but also as accommodation for some of my beefeater buddies and their families. Hands up those of you who knew that beefeaters like me lived inside the Tower of London. No, not many. How many of you didn't know that? Oh. How many of you couldn't care less where we live? Where are you from?
France.
Where? Never heard of it. You can see a second floor of windows over there. Behind those windows used to be the study to Sir Isaac Newton, who was the master of the mint here in the 17th century. And Sir Isaac Newton was a very clever man. He came up with the idea of milling the outside of coins to stop people clipping bits off the edges and making their own. That's really quite clever if you think about it. He also invented gravity, a very fine British invention, invented right here in the Tower of London. Before that, we just used to float about. This is the bell tower. So named, it is a tower with a bell. We did this for you Americans. You take life very literally, don't you? You want to know where it is and what to do on it. In our country, we have a pavement. The Americans have a sidewalk. Stop them walking down the middle. We go riding. The Americans go horseback riding. What part of the horse were you thinking of sitting on? This is the tower where Sir Thomas More was held for refusing to accept King Henry VIII as the supreme head of the church in England. At the same time, and for the very same reason, his very good friend John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, was held in the upper chamber. Both men were to suffer terribly for about 15 months, but could not be persuaded to abandon their beliefs. Were finally led out of these chambers through those gates and up the hill, where they were publicly beheaded as traitors in 1535. Exactly 400 years later, both men were made saints in the Roman Catholic Church. Now, another man that spent some time here was a man called James Scott. He was the Duke of Monmouth and the eldest of up to 17 illegitimate children of King Charles II. After the death of his father in 1685, this incredibly handsome and popular young man was persuaded to stake his claim to the throne, because his uncle, King James II, was a very unpopular Catholic king. To press home his claim, James Scott landed in the west country of England, and he marched inland, gathering popular Protestant support in what is known as the Monmouth or Pitchfork Rebellion. That rebellion was crushed at the Battle of Sedgemoor on the 6th of July, 1685. But James Scott evaded capture by fleeing the battlefield, and he hid in towns and villages for a few days. But he was caught and brought here to the Tower. There was no need for trial, as he was condemned to death in his absence, and 3 days later he was led out of here through the gates and up the hill. But this time, instead of being pelted with fruit and vegetables like everybody else, all the ladies came and they threw flowers in his path as he walked up in silence. That's how incredibly handsome and popular he was. He looked like me. An inflatable version of William Shatner. When he got to the top, he was met by the executioner, a man called Jack Ketch. I call him an executioner, but actually he was a part-time executioner. He was the local butcher and a full-time drinker. This combination led to one of the most botched, bloody and brutal executions in English history. For Jack Ketch was not only drunk that day, we believe he even managed to bring the wrong type of axe to the execution. And he famously took 8 strokes. The first one landed squarely in James Scott's left shoulder blade, partially amputating his left arm. Now Scott's writhing around on the floor, he's quite hard to hit. The second one took the very top of his head off. He managed to turn, he said, "For God's sake, man, finish!" The third one caught him in the right shoulder blade, the fourth in the lower lumbar region. At this point, Ketch had given up, and he threw the axe into the straw. He said, "I can't go on. Here's 30 guineas for a man who can." The Sheriff of London poked him with his sword and said, "You better pick that up, Jack, or you'll be next." So he picked up the axe and went for the fifth stroke, but it was so wet with all the blood, it swiveled in Ketch's hand and slapped James Scott squarely across the back of the head. Thankfully, it knocked him out. There were a further 3 attempts before it was obvious that Scott was dead, and even then the head remained stubbornly attached to the body. So Ketch improvised. He went down on his drunken knees. He pulled out his butcher's knife, and to the stunned silence of the lovely ladies, he proceeded to saw through the remaining stubborn sinew, tendon, gristle, skin, and bones. Sweet dreams, kids. Hashtag bad grandpa. Hashtag wish we'd gone to Harry Potter world now. Strangely, the head and the body were returned to the tower and sewn back together with absolutely no idea why. Of course, when James Scott came here, he came through Traitor's Gate, and that's our next destination, so follow me. Possibly the most famous, possibly the most infamous gate in the world. Again, this was built during the reign of Edward I, as he required a safer and more useful entrance into the tower. Rather than try and go for the narrow, crowded, twisted streets of London, where convoys could be attacked, stores stolen and prisoners set free, he decided to use the River Thames as a highway. He had a hole punched through the outer defensive wall, so that at high tide, boats could pass through these gates and unload their cargoes in safety. And therefore, this was originally known as the Watergate. But if it was known as the Watergate, how then did it become known as Traitor's Gate? Well, that was down to the large numbers of alleged traitors to pass through those grim gates during the Tudor period. Among them, no less than 3 queens of England: Queen Anne Boleyn, Queen Catherine Howard, and Lady Jane Grey, the uncrowned Queen of 9 days. High dignitaries of the church and elder statesmen were no exception. Those and many more poor unfortunate souls would have travelled down from their trials at the Guildhall or the Palace of Westminster, passed through these gates and climbed these stony steps. Here they'd be met by guards and escorted through the archways and off to their cells to await whatever fate had in store. For some it would be a short journey to their place of execution. One of those horrible cells was in the infamous Bloody Tower. There it is. Originally known as the Garden Tower, its name was changed to Tower of Blood, or Bloody Tower, during the Elizabethan period, to commemorate the many tragic events that have happened within. And of them all, perhaps the saddest must be the alleged murders in 1483 of the 2 boy princes. Edward V was an uncrowned king, and he had a little brother called Richard, the Duke of York. They were just 12 and 9 years old. How old are you? How old are you?
In the middle.
How old are you?
11.
Could have said 12, think of the drama. They were brought down from Ludlow Castle to prepare for Edward's coronation on the death of his father, Edward IV, who had died of good living in April of 1483. They were supposed to be looked after by their uncle, Richard. Do you have an uncle, Richard? In June of that year, Richard declared those boys to be illegitimate. Are you No, I can't. In July, he declared himself to be the king, and you know him as Richard III. By August, the sightings of the children had got fewer and fewer. And then we're told in one hot summer's evening, 2 men stole into those boys' bedrooms and murdered them in their beds by putting pillows on their faces and suffocating them. Their little bodies were then bundled down the steps leading into the Wakefield Tower, and they were hidden beneath some stones. The next day, they were secretly removed and buried on the south side of the White Tower. And that's where they remained, undisturbed for 191 years. Until workmen carrying out restoration work removed the old staircase and found the skeletal remains of 2 small boys. Experts of the day declared them indeed to be the missing princes. They were taken down to Westminster Abbey and reinterred in Innocents Corner, where they are to this day. Now, another man that spent a bit of time in there was a man called Sir Walter Raleigh, the great navigator, the buccaneer. He was a pharmacist, he was an author, he was a historian, and he spent 13 and a half years up there. 13 and a half long years. And every single day they made his life an absolute misery. For 13 and a half long years they locked him up there with his wife and kids. Every morning she'd get up and go, "You never take me out." Eventually he's executed on the orders of James I, and when his head was cut off, it was preserved. And then it was delivered to her. And she put it in a red leather bag, a little bag. And she tied the bag to her belt. And she took it everywhere she went. Occasionally she'd bring the head out, put it on a pillow and talk to it. She was nuts. She did that for 29 years. And when she died, the head was buried in her coffin with her. So even in death, nah. You are surrounded by an awful lot of gory, gruesome history, ladies and gentlemen. And if you're from the British Empire, hurrah! And if you're from the British Empire, hurrah! All this history is yours. And if you're from America, could have been yours if only you paid your taxes. You're paying now, eh? London. And behind me and in front of you is the White Tower. Work began on that site in 1078 under the direction of a monk called Gundulph of Beck. It took 20 years to complete, although the windows were later added by Sir Christopher Wren in the 17th century. It's 93 feet tall, with walls that vary in thickness from 15 feet at the base to 11 feet at the top. And on each corner there is a turret. On top of the turrets there are golden crowns, and beneath them weather vanes showing the royal standard. This signifies that this is still a royal palace, though no longer a royal residence. However, kings and queens lived up there for over 500 years. The last monarch to do so was James I in 1603. The royal family lived mainly on the top floor. On the floor below was a banqueting hall, a council chamber, accommodation for knights and their ladies, and the chapel royal of St. John the Evangelist, probably the best preserved Norman chapel in this country, and where all our kings and queens have worshipped on the eve of their coronations. The ground floor was mainly for servants and cooks, but there is another floor. It's below ground level, there are no windows, so it's very dark, and being so close to the river, extremely damp. And this makes it an ideal location to put a wine cellar. You're quite right, though. They really set a low bar, didn't they? Yeah, dark, evil-smelling place. Nowadays, it's not like that. It's light and fragrant and welcoming. But nowadays, it's a gift shop. Believe me, when you see the prices, you too will scream. Now, some of you might not be able to see it, but some of you can. If you look down there, you can see some cages. And unfortunately, we've got bird flu in this country at the moment. It's only 30 miles from London. So we've kept our ravens in now. There are, at the moment, 7 ravens in. 3 of them are out flying, and they've been out flying since before COVID. We can't get them back, but they don't never leave here, so. But they live in the other ones, they live in a 5-star hotel where they don't have to pay the bills, so why would you leave? You know? We feed them every day. I'm on duty today, so I fed them quail, I fed them mice this morning, and some of them got rat and chicken later on. It's all rotten, putrescent meat, just before breakfast. They live to around about 12 years old in the wild, but here they live a lot longer. In fact, we had one that lived to be 44 years old. Yeah, because we look after them, obviously. But there is a legend that says if the ravens ever leave the tower, the White Tower would crumble to dust, the monarchy would fall, and a terrible disaster would befall our country. But it is the 21st century, for goodness sakes. We don't believe that rubbish, we just lock them away. Right, let's just go and see. Can I see? Can we get over there? Yes, let's go over there. Follow me. Green of the Tower of London. But unlike most village greens in this country where you'll find a cricket pitch or perhaps a mill pond, we've got our own private execution site. And that horrific sight, not you, madam, is marked by that small glass memorial over there and is not to be confused with the public scaffold outside on the hill. 3 Queens of England and some others were executed here. But before I tell you some of their stories, I'd like to describe a couple of the buildings that surround us here. If you look down there, you can see a large black and white Tudor building known as the King's House. It dates from 1540. Now, up until quite recently, it was known as the Queen's House because it is named after the gender of the monarch of the day. Before that, it was the King's House. Before that, it was the King's House. Before that, it was the King's House. Before that, it was the Queen's House. Before that, it was the King's House. Before that, it was the King's House, King's House, King's House, King's House. Then it was the Queen's House. Before that, it was the King and Queen's House. Before that, it was the Queen's House. Then it was the King's House. Then it was the King's House. Then it was the King's House. Before that, then it was the Queen's House for a long time. Queen's House for a short time. Queen's House for a very, very short time. King's House. Henry VIII built it. Boo. Now, it's the home of the Constable of the Tower of London now, and being the home of such a high-ranking official, it has sometimes been used to accommodate some very important prisoners. Prior to her execution in 1542, Queen Catherine Howard spent time in there. A man called William Penn spent 8 months on the top floor for his offensive writing, and was only released on the condition that he left the country, which of course he did. He crossed the Atlantic, and he founded the Quaker colonies of Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. Anyone from that neck of the woods? Yes. Yeah, you must be very proud. Your founding father was an English criminal. Starting to make a lot of sense now. Hey, that bell we gave you was founded just 500 yards on the other side of the glass building, madam, when we got that. When we gave you that bell, it was in one piece. You lot broke it. Like you did our language. It's pronounced aluminium. The last prisoner we ever held in there was a man called Rudolf Hess. He was the deputy Führer to Nazi Germany in the 30s and 40s. He fell out with Hitler and his cronies in May 1941. He flew his Messerschmitt over to Glasgow where he landed, and he was captured and brought here for questioning. At the end of those questions of 3 days, he was sent to Wales as punishment. At the end of the war, he was tried for his crimes and sentenced to life imprisonment in Spandau Prison, which is where he died in 1987. And the day after he died, the old bulldozers came in and they completely razed the whole prison to the ground. It's now a Tesco's car park. That's the Beauchamp Tower, and in the Beauchamp Tower are 91 inscriptions carved into the walls by the prisoners. Some of those carvings are over 550 years old. On this side is the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, and when you go in there, you're going to be going and visiting the resting place of many of the people I'm talking about today. And finally, the largest and youngest of all our buildings is the Waterloo Block, which now contains the Crown Jewels and Royal Regalia, and I can see that there is a very small crowd going in. That's a queue of around about 25 minutes. Right, so let's return our attention to this execution site where these three queens, amongst others, were to die. Now, the first victim in 1536 was Queen Anne Boleyn. She was tried and found guilty of adultery and other crimes in a trial held here in the Tower. Now, I'm not sure she was guilty of that, but one thing she was guilty of was that she had failed to provide the king with a son and heir. At the age of 35 and having miscarriages, it's unlikely she will. The king is desperate for a son, so he's moved on to Jane Seymour. Meanwhile, Anne is now a problem because while she lives, the kings of France and Spain and the Holy Roman Empire will never sign any treaty with England because they've been told not to by the Pope. And so Anne must be removed. But she's absolutely petrified at the prospect of dying an agonising death at the hands of a clumsy axeman, and she requested that she be executed in the French style with a two-handed sword. This was granted by the king, and a French master swordsman was sent for from Calais. Imagine the scene over there on the day of the execution. Straw lay all around the scaffold, mainly to absorb the blood, but also to hide the sword, which is wrapped in some sack beneath the straw. The Queen was on her knees with her head bowed in prayer, and the executioner stood directly behind her. When he thought the time was right, very quietly went down, pulled out the sword, held it in readiness above Queen Anne, and then surprisingly turned to his assistant and shouted, "Donnez-moi mon épée," which means, "Bring me my sword." Does it not? It did. See? I could have said "Apportez-moi," but donnez-moi. Comme ci, comme ça. This surprised Anne in such a way that she looked up, at which point he smote her head from her body with one quick clean strike. The head and the body were placed together in an elm box, brought into our chapel and buried up by the altar, and that's where she is to this day. 5 years passed, and the next person to die over there was an old duchess called Margaret Pole, and she had done absolutely nothing wrong. All that she had done was have a son called Cardinal Reginald Pole. and he was going around Europe preaching against King Henry VIII. Now the king twice tried to assassinate Cardinal Pole, but failed. And so instead of grabbing the son, he grabbed the mother instead. And he brought her here, and she was held here with no charge for 2 years. Had no idea why she was here. Admittedly, she was held in great comfort. After all, she was his cousin. Anyway, a death warrant arrived for her on one morning, and unfortunately for her, the executioner was doing his job further up north, so they brought a spare in, a substitute executioner. Whoops. She went up to the scaffold, she looked at the scaffold block, she said, "That's for traitors, I am none such." And then she jumped off the scaffold and ran down towards the bloody tower. The executioner chased after her. When he caught up with her, he hacked her to pieces down there by the bloody tower. A truly horrific end to a 67-year-old innocent woman. Within a year, the axe was to fall again twice on the same day. This time on the pretty young neck of Queen Catherine Howard and her lady-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's sister-in-law. Queen Catherine didn't want to make the same mistake as Queen Anne. She tried really hard to have a baby. Really hard. Not necessarily with the king, but she was definitely trying. She was accused of having a number of affairs, but it was the one with Thomas Culpeper that would catch her out. She's recorded to have said from the scaffold site, "Today I stand before you, the Queen of England, but I'd much rather be the wife and lover of the only man I truly love, Sir Thomas Culpeper." She probably shouldn't have said that. Thomas Culpeper certainly thought so. He was at the back going, "Shut up." Fake news. Jane Boleyn was executed on the same block within 1 hour, and her crime, not telling the king about all those liaisons. The last Queen of England to die over there was Lady Jane Grey. This is a tragic tale of a young girl brought all the way down from Leicestershire and forced onto the throne against her will by her ambitious family. Her father was Henry Grey, he was the Duke of Suffolk. Her father-in-law was John Dudley, he was the Duke of Northumberland, but he was also a teacher to Edward VI, who was a son of Henry VIII. Edward VI was only 9 years old when he came to the throne. But under the tutelage of John Dudley became a great Protestant reformer. By the time he was 15, however, he contracted measles and later tuberculosis. Everyone knew he was dying. And it's at this point in British history that our two major religions in this country start vying for power. On one hand, we had the emerging Protestants led by the Archbishop of Canterbury. His name was Thomas Cranmer. He and Bishops Latimer and Ridley were going around saying what a great idea it would be if Lady Jane Grey was a Protestant Queen of England. On the other hand, we have Mary Tudor, the eldest daughter of Henry VIII. She was over in Norfolk gathering very strong Catholic support. News got out that Edward had died and Lady Jane Grey was quickly brought here to the Tower, and it's from here that she reigned for 9 days. Meanwhile, more and more Catholics were moving over to Norfolk. On the third day of her reign, Lady Jane Grey instructs her best general, John Dudley, to take a cavalry force of 2,000 and wait at Cambridge to ambush Mary. This is tactically brilliant because that is the gateway to London. She also dispatched her fleet from Tilbury to leave London and go round the back of Norfolk and blockade all the ports. What could go wrong? Well, the wind changed and it forced the ships on shore. Those ships' crews took this as a sign from God and they mutinied. They handed their gunpowder and cannons over to Mary. These are odds that John Dudley doesn't like anymore, so he's found a very small rebellion to go and quell over in Buckinghamshire. Back here in London, the Privy Council meet in that house, and they give up. And they decide to write a letter to Mary asking her to take the throne, despite the fact they've already got one. And the man that signs that letter is Henry Grey. The letter is sent, received, accepted, and she comes to London. Not a shot's been fired, everyone's pleased to see her. Except for maybe the bishops, who ride out to plead for forgiveness for preaching against her. Now, you all know this story, of course, you all know this story. You just don't know you know this story. 3 blind mice. 3 blind mice, that's where it comes from. Those 3 bishops are blinded by their faith. See how they run round London trying to drum up support for Lady Jane Grey. They all chased after the farmer's wife. Mary was known as the farmer's wife because she married the King of Spain, Philip, the farmer king. They cut off their tails with a carving knife. No, she didn't. She sent them to Oxford where they were burnt at the stake for heresy, but that doesn't rhyme. So Mary becomes queen. As soon as she's queen, she goes into that chapel and she prays right at the altar, right at the foot of Anne Boleyn's grave. Think of the symbolism there. And when she comes out, she's in a foul mood, and she completely reverses all those reforms that have been put in place by Edward before her, totally contrary to the direction we were going in. You know this story too. Mary, quite contrary. How does your garden grow? How does your religion spread? With silver bells. These are small bells that the priests ring when they lay out the sacraments. Cockle shells, emblems to show that you've been on pilgrimage to the Holy Lands. And pretty maids all in a row, telling us the nuns are allowed back into Westminster Abbey once more. And that's where that comes from. So Mary comes out, she arrests everybody involved. They're all held around here somewhere. Lady Jane Grey's down in number 5 Tower Green. The Dudleys are up in the Beauchamp Tower. Henry Grey, well, he's soon pardoned, because of course he signed the letter. John Dudley, he's soon executed, because he's the main architect in all this. But she's got this problem, and this is the problem. She knows Lady Jane Grey. She likes Lady Jane Grey, and all she wanted to do is convert and become a Roman Catholic. So much so that she sends a personal priest to her every day for 8 months. But Lady Jane Grey refuses. Meanwhile, there's a small rebellion going on over there in Kent, and as the rebellion got closer and closer to London, people recognised one of the ringleaders. It's Henry Grey, and he's coming to free his daughter. Well, this could never happen. From her windows of number 5 Tower Green, Lady Jane Grey can look out and watch as the executioners prepared the scaffold site. From her windows on that cold and frosty February morning, February the 12th, 1554, she can look out and watch her husband, Lord Guildford Dudley, being dragged out of the Beauchamp Tower. He's wearing his finest clothes, but his hands are tied together and tears are rolling down his cheeks. He was dragged out of the tower and up the hill towards that baying mob at the top. Now, they'd have gone quiet while he made his speech and said some prayers. There'd have been a drum roll, a big cheer, and within 1 hour, Guildford Dudley's headless, lifeless corpse returned to the tower in a handcart, brought right up to the scaffold, and then tipped out. And then it was the turn of Lady Jane Grey. She left number 5 Tower Green dressed in mourning clothes now, because of course she's a widow. She walked across the grass, we're told, with great calmness and dignity. When she arrived at the scaffold site, she had to hitch up her skirts to step over her husband's still steaming corpse. And then she climbed the steps. At the top, she was met by a priest, and together they sank to their knees and they prayed. Once the prayers were complete, Lady Jane Grey looked up at the executioner and she begged him to dispatch her quickly. And then, in an act of mercy, the priest stepped forward and helped tie a blindfold round the girl's face. And now we're told she starts to break down. She starts to shake and tremble. She starts to cry. And she called out, "For pity's sake, help me. I know not what to do." You see, in her anxiousness to pray, she was kneeling just a little bit too far from the block. With a blindfold on, she can't find it. She knows if she doesn't find it very soon, this execution is going to go horribly wrong. Well, fortunately for her, the priest saw her plight. He grabbed her hand and forced it gently down upon the block. She regained her composure, put her neck down, put her hands down. The last thing that brave girl said before she died was, "Lord, unto thy care I commit my miserable soul." She gave a signal, and the axe came crashing down. When the axe crashed through that young girl's neck, we believe she'd only just turned 16 years old. And she's laid to rest in our chapel, reunited in death with her husband once more. And that's the end of that story. And also, I'm afraid to say, it's also the end of the tour. But I can't let you go just yet because you're all sad. And you won't write nice things about me on TripAdvisor. Thing of which I crave. So what I think I'll do, I'm going to try and raise your spirits with a final story to send you on your way. It's a cracking tale of love and devotion, of intrigue and escape. And for this story to work properly, I need a muse to inspire me. And that muse needs to be a happily married couple. All right, let's not push it. Let's just go for a married couple. All right, there's 2 people to turn up and start fighting over the map yet. Are you guys together? Yeah. Are you married? Yeah, kinda. Don't you remember? I know, I don't mean to intrude. I have to check. I did this story a couple of days ago and I didn't check. I was halfway through a story of love and devotion when the couple I picked on announced they were brother and sister. We all got a bit uncomfortable. Up to 3 people from West Virginia who thought it was okay. They never come. Sir, you're going to be my Lord Nithsdale. You're held in the Queen's house for your King's house. You're held in the King's house for your part in the first Jacobite rebellion of 1715. You're a traitor and sentenced to death. On hearing of her husband's fate, the young and beautiful Lady Nithsdale set out from her home in Dumfriesshire, Scotland, with some maids, and we have the maids here. and headed for London in a horse-drawn carriage. But after 20 miles, the carriage got stuck in a snowdrift, and so Lady Nithsdale and the maids cut the horses free and continued the remaining 274 miles on horseback all the way to London in the worst blizzards we've ever had in this country. Such love and devotion did that woman have for that man. When she arrived in London, she took rooms around the tower and went off to see the king. Here he is, look. Grumpy, miserable-looking fellow he was. To plea for clemency, but he said no.
No.
Very good, sir. But he was a German and didn't speak any English.
Nine.
But he had some ventriloquist friends who did. But he did grant visitation rights, so everyone got used to seeing Lady Nithsdale and the maids coming to the tower, bringing in the picnic basket, playing in the garden, dancing, singing, that sort of thing, until the eve of the execution, where Lady Nithsdale had now concocted a bold plan of escape. For on this occasion, on entering the room, she and some of the maids quickly disguised Lord Nithsdale as a woman, which was no mean feat, for he was 6'5" and had a big ginger beard. But apparently that's what Scottish women look like. Out of the picnic basket they pulled a big dress, a wig, a purple velvet hooded cloak and some makeup. Meanwhile, the maid outside, that can be you, madam, plied a guard on duty, me, with strong ale and wine. Where are you from?
Cumbria.
Cumbria? There's very small bottles in Cumbria, aren't there? There's that. Get me drunk. You back there, you can't see this very well. This lady's very good at miming. And then she beguiled him with a sexy dance. Then he started coming and going, fetching and carrying, swapping the capes around until the poor guard didn't have a clue who was in and who gone. At which point, Lord Nithsdale took the arm of one of the maids and walked straight out completely unchecked. Eventually, brave young Lady Nithsdale was left alone in the room, and she carried on a two-way conversation for over an hour, fooling the gardener, thinking there really were still two people in the room. And then when she knew the others were clear, she left and pleaded with the guard not to disturb her husband, for he's had his prayers, he wants to make his peace with God, he's going to die in the morning. The guard never checked. He locked it, closed it, went off to drink. There you go. Those two went outside and they fled to Rome. Lord Nithsdale became a papal ambassador and a ski instructor. He lived to be 84 years old and he passed peacefully in his bed. Lady Nithsdale, as you can clearly see, very much younger than her husband, considerably younger, only lasted a few more days before she died of a broken heart. Isn't that a lovely story? The guard was taken from here, taken in front of the governor, and resigned himself to terrible punishment. Could have been hanged, could have been branded, his nose cut off, desiccated, demasculated, stretched on a rack. Ooh, the governor came up with something worse than that. This is what he said. From now on, Jeremiah, you and all other beef eaters that follow, you're going to give guided tours to Have a great day in the Tower of London. Thank you very much.
आमचा टूर संपलेला आहे टॉवर ऑफ लंडनचा आणि आता आम्ही या बिल्डिंगमध्ये आतमध्ये चाललो आहे त्याच्यासाठी लाईनीमध्ये उभो आहोत. इथे क्राउन ज्यूल्स ठेवलेले आहेत आणि त्याच्यामध्ये आपला एक फेमस कोहिनूर हिरा आहे जो मला पाहण्याची खूप उत्सुकता आहे. पु ल देशपांडे आणि अंतू बर्व्याची आठवण येते आहे मला आता. आत्ताच मी क्राउन ज्वेल्स सेक्शन बघून बाहेर आले, म्हणजेच काय तर मी कोहिनूर बघून बाहेर आले. छान आहे, मस्त पांढऱ्या रंगाचा लखलखता फ्लॉलेस हिरा आहे. पण कोहिनूरपेक्षा मोठा अजून एक हिरा आहे तिथे ज्याला कलिनन असं म्हणतात. तो कोहिनूरच्या 5 पट मोठा आहे, जास्त तेजस्वी पण आहे. तो जास्त छान होता. कोहिनूर आपला म्हणून चांगला वाटतो. तो ज्या मुकुटामध्ये बसवला आहे त्याच्या आजूबाजूला जी रत्न आहेत त्याच्यामुळे तो उठून दिसतो हिरा. अजून नुसता हिरा बघायला काही मजा नाही, जेव्हा तो असा जडवलेला असतो कशात तेव्हाच तो छान असतो. हे आहे टॉवर ऑफ लंडन. नोटोरियस प्रिझन होता हा एकेकाळी. इथे अनेक जणांना फाशी दिलेलं आहे, त्यांचं सरकलम केलेलं आहे, वेगवेगळ्या पद्धतीने त्यांना मारण्यात आलेलं आहे. अशा या ठिकाणी एका कडेकोट बंदोबस्तामध्ये या बिल्डिंगमध्ये त्यांनी सगळी रत्नं ठेवलेली आहेत. अर्थातच कॅमेरा आतमध्ये न्यायला परवानगी नाही आहे, त्याच्यामुळे मला आतमधलं शूटिंग नाही करता आलं. शिवाय राणीच्या कॉफीनवर इतके दिवस ठेवलेला तिचा मुकुट तोही पाहायला मिळाला. त्याच्यामध्ये पण मोठे मोठे छान, त्याच्यातच तो कलिनन आहे मोठा हिरा, नाही सॉरी तो त्याच्यात नाही आहे, पण त्याच्यातही छान छान रत्न आहेत. छान आहे कलेक्शन, चमचमणारे झगझगणारे, बघायला मजा येते दागिने. हे इथे राहणारे इथले शिपाई असे कडक सुटाबुटात वावरत असतात इकडून तिकडे आणि लोकांना मदत करत असतात. इथे रेवन्स पण आहेत. रेवन म्हणजे मोठे कावळे, डोमकावळे म्हणू शकतो आपण त्यांना. आणि अशी एक आख्यायिका आहे की जोपर्यंत या बिल्डिंग्सवर, या टॉवर ऑफ लंडनमध्ये रेवन उडतो आहे तोपर्यंत ब्रिटिश एम्पायर टिकेल, चालू राहील. जेव्हा इथे या वास्तूला सोडून हे कावळे निघून जातील तेव्हा राज्य पण लयाला जाईल, अशी आख्यायिका आहे. पण सध्या बर्ड फ्लू असल्यामुळे सगळे कावळे पिंजऱ्यामध्ये बंदिस्त आहेत. इथे आता आमचा टॉवर ऑफ लंडनचा टूर संपलेला आहे आणि बाहेर आलोय आम्ही या दरवाजाने आणि समोर इकडे आता आहे टॉवर ब्रिज. आम्ही आता बाहेर येत होतो तेव्हा जिथे कावळा दिसला तेव्हा नुकताच हा ब्रिज उघडला होता आणि एक मोठं जहाज चाललं होतं, ते तिकडे गेलंय आता. त्या जहाजासाठी हा रस्ता उघडलेला होता ब्रिजचा आणि मग तो लगेच बंद झाला, ते पण आम्हाला बघायला मिळालं. सो अशी ही आमची आजची टूर झाली.